Subaru's Outback is a case study in how to make Americans start buying station wagons again. Step 1, don't call it a station wagon. Step 2, make it more off-road capable. Step 3, make it look a little bit more like an SUV with off-road cladding all the way around and a really high ground clearance. Ground clearance in this model is over 9 inches. Now you'll notice that Subaru no longer calls the Outback an Outback wagon, and some Subaru fans are really rabid about referring to this as a station wagon. But in fact it is, because the bulk of this is shared with the Subaru Legacy sedan. The seats, the dashboard, the hood, the entire front end of the vehicle, suspension designs, etc. Front doors forward, it is essentially a Subaru Legacy, and the profile of the vehicle is very station wagon. And you know what? That is not a problem at all, because station wagons are eminently practical. You'll notice up front this has the ground clearance that you'd expect in a crossover, but the front end design of a sedan. Of course, excluding these go-anywhere off-road bits. That means this is more aerodynamic than the average crossover, something like a Santa Fe or an Edge or a Chevy Blazer, because the front end isn't quite so high and not quite as square either. The big advantage for this body style is roof height. Even though we have more ground clearance than pretty much any of the competition for the Outback, roof access height is among the lowest in this group. When you take a look at the spec sheets, it appears that Subaru is including these roof rails in the height of the vehicle, so keep that in mind. And a lot of the competition, they're simply talking about the base roof height, excluding the roof rails. You'll notice that this roof is right about shoulder height for me. Compared to the Hyundai Santa Fe that I happen to have in my driveway at the moment, the roof line in the Outback is considerably lower. This roof line is about eye height for me, and I'm not talking about the roof rails that stick up a little bit higher than that. The Santa Fe has considerably less ground clearance than the Outback, however. That's because the body is boxier. It's more traditional SUV shaped. If you're into outdoor sports like kayaking or skiing, or you just like to put a Thule on top of your vehicle, it's going to be an awful lot easier to get at those items on the Outback than on really any of the competition because of the shape of this vehicle. But if I open the hatch, you will notice that there is one compromise, and that is the height of the opening. The opening here is certainly smaller than the Santa Fe's. Whipping out my handy dandy measuring tape, we have just about 29 inches of vertical clearance, compared to, in the Santa Fe, approximately 32.5. But let's get back to the Outback Wilderness. You can see we have these pretty chunky black bumpers front and rear. These are a little bit less expensive to replace if you end up scuffing them up out on that trail. And of course, scuffs aren't going to show quite as well on these as they would on a body color painted bumper. We have Geolandar all-terrain tires. These are not the most aggressive all-terrain tires, but they are really fitting for the Outback Wilderness, because this is not trying to be a Rubicon version of the Outback, if you will. This is not trying to be a Bronco. Instead, this is trying to give Subaru shoppers a little bit more of what they're already interested in. Allow them to go a little bit further off the beaten path, and tires are a huge, huge deal. If you took a Wrangler Rubicon and you put slick summer tires on it, it would not be getting up very many steep hills. But put all-terrain tires on a vehicle like this, and instantly it's more capable than it was before. Fitting the Outback with more ground clearance and more plastic body cladding had already convinced the average owner that this was no mere station wagon, it was now instantly an SUV. So clearly for the Wilderness, we need to bump that up to 11. So we have even more body cladding going on and even more ground clearance. An impressive 9.5 inches of clearance. This has more clearance than the body-on-frame 4Runner at 9 inches, way more than the Blazer at 7.4 inches, and tons more than a Nissan Murano at 6.9. In fact, this is nearly double some quote-unquote crossovers or sport utility vehicles out there. Ford's Mustang Mach-E, this is nearly double what we find in that supposed electric crossover. The next step in the Wilderness transformation was to get more torque to the ground. Subaru could have used a 2-speed transfer case like we find in the Jeep Grand Cherokee, but that would have added weight, it would have added a lot of cost and complexity to the Outback. It also may not have fit under the body and under the hood. Instead, what Subaru decided to do was borrow some components out of the larger 3-row Subaru Ascent. This has basically the same 2.4-liter turbo engine that we find in the regular Outback and that larger Ascent model, producing the same 277 pound-feet of torque. But unlike the regular Outback, they've borrowed the final drive ratio from the Ascent. That gives this Outback a lower effective starting ratio and greater torque multiplication abilities than we find in the regular Outback. The downside to that is that when you're cruising along at regular highway speeds, the engine is revving higher and fuel economy ends up suffering a little bit. This drops down from 26 miles per gallon combined down to 24 miles per gallon. So even though this is a 2.4-liter turbo, not a V6 or a V8 like you might find in some of the competition, fuel economy is actually a little bit closer to some of those larger displacement options. Depending on your preferences, this seating position could be either a pro or a con. We have the same sort of ground clearance that we find in some rugged off-road SUVs, but the driver's seat is going to be a little bit lower to the ground because of the unibody design and the fact that this still has the seating position of the legacy sedan. The seat frames, the seat controls, the steering wheel, the dashboard, everything in this front passenger compartment is exactly the same as the Subaru Legacy. That means that if you prefer a more reclined seating position where your legs are a little bit further out in front of you, you'll really notice that down there. They're just about under that portion of the dashboard, but you want a more commanding view of the road, this is going to be basically the only option available. If, on the other hand, you want something that's a little bit more upright in seating position, a little bit more like a minivan or a large SUV, then you might want to take a look at an Edge or a Blazer or something like that. Jumping into the back seat, the boxy profile of the Outback gives us a lot of headroom. Sitting right here behind myself, I have about 2 inches of headroom. This does not have a moonroof, so keep that in mind. And we have a ton of legroom. This is essentially based off of a mid-size sedan. So we have mid-size sedan-like room across the rear bench. This is the kind of vehicle where you could easily put 3 adults if you needed to, or perhaps 2 adults in a child seat, or 2 child seats in an adult if you had to. There's a fold-down center armrest with 2 cup holders right there, heated rear seats in this model, air vents integrated into the center console, and these seats not only flip forward like this in a 60/40 fashion, but they also have a recline. There's a little lever right here, and then they give you about 2.5 inches of recline. To help protect the interior, we have rubber wilderness floor mats, rubber material on the backs of the rear seat backs rather than fabric or carpet, imitation leather upholstery with this really interesting golf ball-like texture. Although not exactly interior protecting, there are tons of gold accents everywhere and even little Subaru Wilderness t-shirt tags. There's gold on the shifter, gold on the steering wheel, and even gold stitching on the seats. But oddly enough, no gold seatbelts. I do think that's a missed opportunity. Jumping back into the cargo area for a moment, we don't find as much storage space back here as you'll find in, say, a Honda Passport, but you will find more room back here than in the average compact crossover. Also, more interior length from back here in the cargo area all the way up there to the dashboard for longer items. Why am I talking about a compact crossover when this theoretically plays in the midsize space? That's all down to pricing. As I'll talk about later in this video, the Outback really crosses and blurs the lines between segments. Is it a wagon? Is it an SUV? Is it a crossover? What is the Outback? And is it a compact priced vehicle or a mid-sized priced vehicle? It's also an interesting twist because the Outback is relatively inexpensive if we're talking about the base model. And there are a decent number of compact crossovers that will easily be more expensive than the base versions of this. So you could get something that's a little bit longer, a little bit bigger on the inside, a little bit more off-roady than, say, a Volkswagen Tiguan for about the same price. In my exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, I am now going to give this model 9 out of 10 points. We do have a power hatch, which is a really handy feature. To give it a sportier vibe and help hide things like bicycle tire marks, Subaru has given the Wilderness a black sealing treatment. So the eyesight safety system up here, the sunglass holder, everything like that becomes black as well. Again, no moonroof in this particular model. The Wilderness logo is embossed on the front headrests. Again, I think the lack of orange seat belts is a little bit of a missed opportunity here in the Wilderness trim. We do have that gold stitching on the seats. Bolstering on the front seats is moderate. It's not terribly aggressive, so larger folks shouldn't have a problem, but smaller people probably aren't going to be tossed around. Now, in a vehicle like this that's theoretically a bit more off-road oriented, I'm surprised that we don't have any additional grab handles. We do have one handle right there up by the ceiling, but that's the same one that we find in the regular Outback model, and then of course the regular door handle right there. Moving over to the dashboard, we have a lot of soft touch materials going on, more accent stitching, a place where you can keep smartphones or other knickknacks for the passenger there, and this very distinctive large touchscreen system. This is something that I've really loved about the Outback since this generation launched. This screen is not standard in all Outback models, but the vast majority of the ones you'll find on dealer lots will have this because only the base model gets a 2-screen setup. I'm actually surprised that they bothered to give the vehicle 2 different infotainment systems, even though that model is relegated just to the base trim. You'll also notice that thanks to a software update, Apple CarPlay uses this entire screen. It's a really great look. It really gives you sort of an iPad-like experience. It's worth noting that CarPlay cannot operate in that particular format at the moment. That's expected at some point later in time. We have an engine start-stop button there, USB inputs for that system, electric parking brake, a pretty traditional shift right here, again, more of those orange accents, 2 very large and deep cup holders, so you'd have no problem fitting a big gulp in there and making sure it doesn't splash around. Soft touch armrest right there. 2-stage storage compartment. Not too much room in there because there is a transmission effectively under that area. This has a longitudinal engine, so the packaging is a little bit different than the average crossover. On the driver's side, again, more orange accents going on there for that instrument cluster. Other than that, it's basically the same one that we find in the rest of the Outback line. And then we have the same 3-spoke steering wheel we find in the rest of the Outbacks as well, with this little toggle right down here that rolls through the various options right there in that multifunction cluster. Before we get out on the trail, let's talk about how the Outback drives out on more regular road surfaces. 0-60 happened in this model in 6.1 seconds. As anticipated, that's a little bit faster than the regular Outback, about 0.2 of a second difference. And 60 to 0 stopping distances are longer. This particular model came in at 131 feet. That's 6 feet longer than the regular Outback. That's all due to the different tires that we have on this model. The Geolandar all-terrain tires are a really good balance between on-road drivability and a little bit more aggressive off-road ability than you'll find in a typical all-season tire. It's important to keep in mind that with the Wilderness trim, Subaru did not decide to change the character of the Outback very much. So the Outback is still straddling the fence between off-road ability and on-road daily driver livability. If you were to really improve one, you affect the other. So something like a Jeep Wrangler Rubicon is really not great to drive out on your favorite winding mountain road. And something like a Subaru Legacy is not going to be as off-road capable as this because the suspension is a little bit different. It's closer to the ground, etc. Subaru's mission has always been to design pragmatically capable off-road vehicles, and that's really important to understand. Subaru is not trying to compete with the Ford Bronco or the top-end versions of the Jeep Grand Cherokee in either price or capability. Even though Subaru has definitely developed a bit of a reputation in terms of off-road ability in some circles, you're not going to find this climbing the Rubicon Trail. And to be perfectly rational, that's okay, because although some people off-road every weekend, that's not the demographic that Subaru is targeting with this vehicle. And truth be told, the average buyer of a Jeep Wrangler or a Ford Bronco is not going to be off-roading every weekend either. If you plan on spending every weekend at the state off-road park, you might want to take a look at something else. But if you find yourself going to BLM land or a national park or a state park and you end up on roads like the one that I'm on here, which is not exactly the best maintained road, this is going to be absolutely fine for all seasons, whether it's raining or it's a little bit icy out there or whether it's fine weather like it is right now, as long as you have the right tires. And this really is where the Geolandar tires come into play, because on a trail like this, even though stopping distance is longer on regular pavement, if I were to just bury the brake pedal here, stopping distance is going to be better on this kind of road surface. So again, everything is a bit of balance, and the factory balance on this vehicle tips the teeter-totter a little bit more in favor of off-roading, while not really giving up that daily driver livability. If you were to go out and buy Wrangler Rubicon and put in some really knobbly 35-inch off-road tires, your stopping distance is going to be absolutely enormous, and the handling ability is really going to suffer as well. The lower final drive ratio also gives us a bit more engine braking, but we don't have too much. I'm actually going a little bit quick down this trail for my tastes, and this is as low as the transmission will go with the paddles engaged. If you want to go slower out on the trail, you're left to using the brakes or relying on the brake-based X mode system. This has no locking differentials. It has a multi-plate clutch in the center. It can send power to the rear differential, but the rear differential and the front differential are always open. The system relies on brake application on each corner to try and detect a spinning tire and then brake it so that way it can send power across to the other side. This is generally speaking not going to be as capable as a true locking differential, but again, lighter weight, better fuel economy, better on-road driving dynamics. The X mode system is what Subaru calls their all-speed traction control system. In the Subaru Outback Wilderness, it operates at higher speeds than you'll find in the regular Outback, but it will still cut out over certain speeds. There are 3 different drive modes. Normal's pretty self-explanatory. Then there is snow and dirt, and then deep snow and mud. Deep snow and mud allows a bit more wheel spin to help clear the tires of the mud or the snow in whatever driving situation you might be on. It's less obvious to the driver, but on downhill slopes like the one that I'm on right here, the system is using the brakes to slow me down rather than simply engine braking. On this trail, when you floor the Outback, you'll definitely notice that we get a lot of good grip, but we still don't have a starting ratio that's quite as low as some of the competition. So this will never feel quite as peppy in some of those really low speed maneuvers as something like a Grand Cherokee or even a Honda Passport sometimes can. And that's all down to the torque multiplication ability of this particular drivetrain. This CVT does not have a terribly low starting ratio, and even though they've put a more aggressive final drive ratio on this from the Ascent, the lowest ratio possible in this system is not as low as some of the competition. Now, Subaru compensates for that by giving us a turbocharged engine with a decent amount of torque, but you're still going to find a bit more low-end grunt, a little bit more pull in something else. It's also important to keep in mind that when you take a look at some off-road videos that I have seen on the Outback Wilderness when they're bombing up hills, remember, they're bombing up hills. And when you take a look at more of a rock crawling oriented vehicle like a Toyota 4Runner or a Wrangler or the new Bronco, etc., the benefit to a locking differential is low speed control. So if you have the ability for all the wheels to be spinning at exactly the same rate, and whichever tire it is that has traction, you have the ability to crawl over obstacles like rock faces, etc. Obviously, lockers may or may not be used on that particular rock face depending on the situation. I'm generalizing here, but you will notice that you have the ability to crawl in a more controlled fashion, a slower fashion, and a vehicle like this cannot do that because it does not have the ability to lock the differential. So on this vehicle, you end up having to sort of floor it and then just hope that you can get enough oomph to get you over that obstacle that you're going to encounter. Serious folks that are into weekly off-roading will likely scoff at that, but remember, this is about pragmatic off-road ability. This is the kind of vehicle that will give you 24 miles per gallon out on the daily drive, be completely daily driver livable, and be more capable than your average crossover or SUV. That's why when it comes to the rest of the review numbers, I'm still going to give this an A when it comes to handling. These tires are not going to be as capable on-road as the base tires, but this still has a good, solid, sorted feel to it out on the road. And it still has excellent ride quality. We have a lot of ground clearance and we have a decent amount of wheel articulation, relatively soft springs, so this is very comfortable whether your daily commute is on a road like this every day. I do end up on roads that are not too dissimilar to this on a regular occasion. This is very, very comfortable. And it has a relatively quiet cabin. Cabin quietness did not change at all versus the last Outback that I drove, so I'm going to give this exactly the same score. Now, on the fuel economy front, I've been averaging 23 miles per gallon. That is definitely below the regular Outback, and it all has to do with the final drive ratio, because out on the open highway, the engine is spinning a lot faster, so if you do a lot of highway driving, especially higher speed highway driving, you might want to give the Wilderness a good long think before you choose this over the regular Outback model, because the regular model is certainly going to be more fuel efficient. Now let's dive into pricing. For 2022, Subaru has released pricing for the Outback. It's going to start at $26,945. If you want the premium trim, and I think that most people will, that's going to be a decent bump up to $29,145. But you do get a lot of content. Leather steering wheel, 2-zone automatic climate control, power driver's seat, and of course the 11.6-inch LCD infotainment system. One of the odd things about the Outback is that the base model does not get the 11.6, but pretty much every other version of the Outback does. And instead, Subaru designed a dual 7-inch screen for that base model. I have to wonder if that actually ends up being less expensive than simply giving every model in the lineup the 11.6-inch screen. I wouldn't be too surprised if at some point in the future, the Outback just ended up getting the larger screen standard, but at this point in time, it's not. If you want the turbocharged engine, that's going to be the XT trims. $35,145 is the minimum point of entry there. The Wilderness trim, $36,995 currently, and the Touring trim is the top-end Outback, the most expensive one you can get. It's $41,070, of course, before tax, title, license, and that pesky destination charge. With a range from just under $27,000 to just over $41,000, the Outback not only has a fairly narrow price range compared to some of the competition, but it also starts lower than a number of mid-size crossovers in the US, and that's likely why the Subaru Outback is one of the best-selling, if not the best-selling mid-size vehicle, depending on exactly how you slice and dice the different categories. With that out of the way, let's dive into the competition, and the first competitor has to be the Jeep Grand Cherokee, because this is the one that I get asked about most frequently, even though the Grand Cherokee really is kind of a different animal to the Subaru Outback. Both Jeep and Subaru have cultivated images of very outdoorsy, very capable vehicles, but there is an important distinction between the way that Subaru's all-wheel drive functions and the way that the all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive system in the Grand Cherokee functions, whatever it is you want to call it. The Grand Cherokee is technically a unibody crossover because it's a blend of car-like features and SUV-like features or truck-like features, but it has a unibody rather than a body-on-frame design. However, the drivetrain is still very truck-based. In fact, you get the same engines and transmissions as you'd find in the Ram truck line. And this is an important thing because the Grand Cherokee has two-speed transfer cases where there is a complete, full, an unequivocal lock of the center coupling in the vehicle, and of course they have available locking differentials as well. The ability to not only lock the center coupling and lock the rear axle, but also to really improve your gear ratios means that the Grand Cherokee really is in a different category in terms of capability. You can also get an adaptive air suspension that will give you even more ground clearance than we find in the Subaru Outback. The downside is that you're going to pay for that because the Grand Cherokee with all-wheel drive starts at $36,970. If you want the two-speed transfer case, that's $38,660. Now, there is a reasonable amount of cash on the hood of the Grand Cherokee because it is being completely redesigned for the next model year. You can already check out the Grand Cherokee L. Basically, the new one's going to be the two-row version of that. And we don't know exactly how much that new Grand Cherokee is going to cost yet. You can expect it to be a little bit more expensive, at least, than the current model. Now, I've seen a lot of videos online recently comparing the Subaru Outback Wilderness to something like a 4Runner or a Grand Cherokee out on some more rugged off-road trails. And, well, yes, in some of those videos, both vehicles will complete the task. There's a key difference in the way that they complete the task. In a vehicle like the 4Runner or a Grand Cherokee or anything with a two-speed transfer case, a locking rear differential, and a completely lockable center coupling, you'll notice that those vehicles are crawling over the obstacle in a very slow and controlled way. One wheel might come up in the air and it just keeps spinning at the same rate as the other wheels. You can definitely go over those larger obstacles with a lot of care and a lot of ease. In the Subaru Outback, it kind of requires bombing down the trail. It requires more throttle application, a lot more wheel spin, and some willingness to carry through some of those obstacles a little bit faster than perhaps I might want to. And that's because even in the Outback Wilderness, we don't have a locking rear differential or the ability to command a complete lock of the center coupling either, and obviously no two-speed transfer case. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing because there are pros and cons to every setup, and the big advantage to the Outback is fuel economy. The second big advantage would be handling ability. It's a lot lighter, and it will really feel lighter and more nimble out on the road. And then, of course, there's that on-road handling ability. By making the vehicle lighter and less complicated and a little bit lower to the ground in terms of its center of gravity, they've been able to make it still soft to give you good ride quality out on a rough, winding mountain road and still have the ground clearance that you might want, while not giving up as much in terms of on-road ability as you might think. And in terms of off-road ability, the base four-wheel drive system that we find in the Grand Cherokee that doesn't have the rear locker or the two-speed transfer case is not really going to be that far off of the Subaru Outback Wilderness in terms of general four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive capability. It will be a little bit better just because of the transfer case design itself, but no locking differentials means that it's actually not going to be that far apart. However, there are better and more expensive versions of the Grand Cherokee available, and if you really want to set things apart, there's the Trailhawk. That's going to be $46,150 at least. With that out of the way, let's dive into the Blazer because honestly, this is a little bit more like the Subaru Outback, even though it starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle. For 2022, the Blazer has become a bit more expensive because the bottom two trim levels of the Blazer have been discontinued, and that means that the base engine is now a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo for $33,400. You'll notice that that base price of the Blazer is well into the pricing lineup of the Subaru Outback. So clearly, if you're looking to spend less money, have all-wheel drive, it's going to be a lot less expensive to buy one of those base Outback models, although you will get lower performance because the turbo is not standard there. The Blazer is not really that much older than the Subaru Outback, but the interior design definitely feels a little bit behind the times, especially when you take a look at the infotainment system and you see that smaller screen in the dash versus the nearly 12-inch screen that we find in the Subaru. Subaru's software has a little bit less polish than General Motors' infotainment software, but the screen size definitely makes a difference. On the other hand, the Blazer is available with a naturally aspirated V6 engine if you're interested in that rather than a turbocharged engine, and of course traditional automatic transmissions rather than the CVTs that we find in the Subaru. The downside is going to be fuel economy. The Blazer is not going to be as efficient as the Outback really any way that you slice it, but you will get a more traditional feel, and there is an available torque vectoring rear axle. Next up, we have the Ford Edge, which in my mind is sort of the quintessential crossover for some reason. Maybe it's just the boxy proportions that we found pre-refresh. They've tried to soften the lines a little bit, make it look a little bit more like the Ford Escape, but the basics of the Edge that we've all known for a while are still there. It's roomy, it's fairly boxy, it starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle. There's a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo or a 2.7-liter twin-turbo V6. That's one of the more exciting engine options in this segment. However, you should know that that model, even though it produces 335 horsepower, is not necessarily going to be that much quicker than some of the other turbo options in this segment, like the Santa Fe Turbo or, of course, the Subaru Outback. And that's because that particular engine and transmission combination in the Edge can't deliver all the oomph in first gear. And it appears that Subaru doesn't really do much torque limiting in the lower gear ratios on the CVT. And that's why the Edge, depending on exactly which metric you're looking at, may be a hair faster, but it's not going to be that much faster. On the other hand, Ford did give the interior a pretty significant refresh lately, and they put in a 12-inch LCD in the dashboard standard, and that really helps things out. It's going to start at $32,750. Of course, there are going to be some more cash on the hood offers on the Ford dealer, so I would expect base price to actually be a little bit closer to the starting price of the Outback Premium. The downside to the more traditional drivetrain in the Edge is fuel economy again. 24 miles per gallon in that model. If you choose all-wheel drive, you'll get definitely better fuel economy in the Subaru Outback. Overall reliability ratings are pretty similar, honestly, between the Outback and the Ford Edge. Subaru has had a few reliability stumbles. It appears that the Ford Edge is in a pretty similar window, but the 2-liter turbo in the Edge seems to be a little bit more reliable. And last but certainly not least, we have my other top pick in this segment, the Hyundai Santa Fe. One of the main reasons that I'm a fan of the Santa Fe is one of the exact same reasons that I'm a fan of the Subaru Outback, and that is that the base model is quite inexpensive. It is a little bit more than the Outback, starting at $27,200 versus $26,945 for the Subaru. But based on average dealer discounts and the fact that you don't seem to get much of a discount at the Subaru lot, I would expect actual out-the-door pricing of the base trim to be pretty similar. Now, the two vehicles are fairly different. The Santa Fe is a much more upright, much boxier vehicle, whereas again, the Outback is a stretched off-road wagon. And that means that the interior shapes are going to be a little bit different. The interior from the dashboard all the way to the tailgate in the Outback is a little bit longer, but it's not quite as tall, not quite as boxy as the Santa Fe. The Santa Fe has 3 different engine options available, and performance is shockingly similar between the bottom engine and the top engine in this and in the Outback. 0 to 60 acceleration with the naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine is almost identical to the Outback, and 0 to 60 acceleration with the 2.5-liter turbo in the Santa Fe is almost identical to the 2.4-liter turbo in the Outback, right around 6.2 to 6.3 seconds 0 to 60. Slotting right in the middle of things is the one thing that we don't find in the Subaru, which is a hybrid drivetrain in the Santa Fe, and I have to say that's probably my favorite drivetrain for that particular vehicle. Santa Fe versus Outback, there are going to be some pros and cons and certainly some trade-offs here. If you want to know more about those, I have a video where I take a deeper dive into Outback versus Santa Fe. But in a nutshell, the Santa Fe has a somewhat controversial transmission, the DCT in that 2.5-liter turbo. If you get the regular naturally aspirated engine, then we get a traditional 8-speed automatic, a lot less controversial. If you get the 1.6-liter hybrid, then we get a turbocharged engine, a 6-speed automatic transmission, and of course the hybrid system. So a little bit less controversial there. In the Subaru, of course, we have a continuously variable automatic, which is not everybody's cup of tea. Reliability is a little bit higher on the Santa Fe. The interior is definitely a little bit roomier because of the way that it's been packaged. We find more cargo area in the back and more legroom in the Santa Fe as well. Ground clearance is really not too far off between the Santa Fe and the Outback, and actual all-wheel drive capability is relatively similar, except if we take a look at the Outback Wilderness, which has some tweaked software programming to help improve performance, especially out on longer trails. But the bigger off-road difference between these two vehicles is the suspension tuning. The Outback is a lot more comfortable for those longer off-road road trips. I recently was on a pretty long off-road trail test driving a new pickup truck, and after about 20 or 30 minutes, my back and my neck were absolutely done with the trail, and we still had about an hour and a half of driving left to do. That kind of trail would have been absolutely perfect for the Outback because the suspension is soft, it's compliant, we have higher profile tires to really help absorb some of those bumps. And if you're the kind of person that really wants to go to that wilderness park or that BLM piece of property or your favorite state park, and you have to drive for miles and miles and miles down a well-maintained or moderately maintained gravel or dirt road, the Subaru is just simply going to be more comfortable than most of the other options. The Santa Fe would do it without question, so would something like a Chevy Blazer, because most of those roads don't have big rocks or big ruts on them, but it's going to be a lot more livable and a lot more comfortable in the Subaru Outback. Now, if my money were on the line, I think that I would take the Santa Fe because I like the interior and exterior design just a little bit more, and I like the incredible cargo practicality that we have in the back. But both of these vehicles are really, really great options, especially if you're cross-shopping with the compact crossover. If you're looking at a RAV4 or CRV or a Subaru Forester, I suggest taking a look at the Outback or the Santa Fe because the price tag on them is not going to be much off of where we see the RAV4 or CRV. You're going to be getting pretty similar feature content, if not more feature content, in either of these options. Similar fuel economy, but a much bigger and roomier and more premium feeling interior. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, and of course, check out our new TikTok account, and of course, find us at alexonautos.com. There's going to be some new exclusive web-only content there coming soon.